which is fine. And so instead of I'm not going to wait too much longer. We're just going to start now, and we'll play catch up as people get here. But 2 weeks in the book of John, we had just done Matthew, Mark, Luke. What happened? Oh, yes. I'm a bad person. Thank you, Pastor Patrick. 2 weeks in the book of John. And then at the end of it, we have what we did the one time called a buffer week, which is actually a lot of fun, which is it's a week where there's no teaching material, but we are here to answer questions. So at the end of this, not next Sunday, the following one, we'll all still meet here. There will be no curriculum, but that's the time if you have any questions about the Gospels or anything else, you can come and we'll have a conversation about it. I think last time we did it, we ended up talking about like mega church and giftings and prophetic words. It was like a whole fun thing. And so if you have a question about demonology that you've been itching to ask, that is the Sunday to ask it. That is not next Sunday, it's the following one. I'm going to get into this, and then I have a question at the end of class I want to run by, but I'm going to hope that the room is more full when I ask it. And so John is really interesting because up until this point, we have had a pretty consistent way of teaching across these three. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not identical, but they're very similar and they share a lot of source material. And then you get to the book of John, and John is doing his own thing. He's seemingly not interested in repeating all the information that was repeated in the first three, which kind of makes sense, right? The first one is that he was written much later than the other three. So he has a little bit of a gap of time when he's getting to sit and write about his gospel account. And part of what people think is that because there's such a bit of a gap, the understanding is that he's not trying to repeat things that were already spoken and that people would already know. By the time you get to the Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have written their Gospels. John is going a different route with the assumption that if you want to get all of those historical events, you're going to get them in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is a very different story in and of itself. Even when you look at like the groups of people that they're writing to, right? Over here, these guys are pretty locked in, right? Matthew's writing to the Jews, Mark's writing to the Roman Gentiles, Luke's writing to the Greeks. John is writing to everyone. He's writing a gospel account that anyone can understand. You don't really have to have a specific background to make sense of it. He's writing something that if you were to give it to a stranger off the street, they would be able to understand it without all the complex historical understanding that the other three brought. Not to say that what they did wasn't good. It's just John is very refreshing because it seems too simple. It seems like a very simple thing to read. And it's not that he's ignoring any historical context. He's just saying if you want all of those bits and pieces, these three are your guys. He's presenting an entirely new gospel account, which is really cool. The way I would sort of say it is that John is not so much interested in telling you what happened as much as he is interested in telling you what it all means. What is the point of all of the things that we know about Jesus? He really is the theologian in the group of the four of them. He says things and shares things that are very theologically dense. John 3:16 is one of those verses that we talk about quite easily. There's a lot of weight in John 3:16. There's a lot of foundational understanding about the gospel narrative in that. And so sometimes you read through the book of John and you go, wow, everything's so simple. It's simple at the surface level, but it's actually very deeply rooted in theology at the core. Matthew would ask the question, is Jesus the Messiah? John would ask something like, who is Jesus in the reality of the life that we live in? They're these bigger existential questions, which I really enjoy because it makes it a little bit different. You can have a lot of fun studying these three together. You get to the book of John and it feels like a whole different thing entirely. Not that like I don't assume that everyone here plays like video games, but someone said John's like a DLC. It's like its own separate side thing that has a little bit to do with the main story, but it also acts as its own sort of entity. A few things to know about John that make it a little different. The way that John is formatted is also not as rigid, I would say, as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because he's not so concerned with the historical narrative. But there are a few things he does that are very unique just to his gospel. First is this. There's no birth narrative in John. He is not speaking about the birth of Jesus in the same way that Matthew and Luke do. He is starting before creation. He's starting way before humanity was formed. He's not starting in Bethlehem. He's starting in eternity backwards, right? Which is a really interesting starting point. So he's not even trying to explain this human birth of Jesus, he's starting by saying, in the beginning, Jesus was there. He was in the world before the world was formed. He was a part of what was happening at this very deep and beautiful, what's the word for space word I'm looking for? No. Huh? Yeah, in this cosmos level, Jesus existed. And so if you're going in saying, well, I wonder what John's going to say about his birth, nothing. He's saying before anyone was born, Jesus was there. He existed and he was there. He transcends that. John also, weirdly enough, no parables. He doesn't include any of the parabolic teachings of Jesus. He doesn't teach in parables in the Gospel of John. What he does do is he teaches in these really long, dense discourses. When he writes about what Jesus said, they're not parabolic stories. They're very theologically rich moments. John chapter 3, for example, we know John 3:16. All of John chapter 3, very, very profound. Jesus is going on this very long-winded explanation about what it means to be born again and what happens if you receive him into your life. There's these really profound moments that are not parabolic. They're just straightforward theology. This one I just thought was funny. No exorcisms, which kind of makes it a little boring. I kind of like the little demon vibe. Just none of that happens in John, which is really interesting because the book of John is so focused on this battle between light and darkness, but it kind of just ignores the exorcism. This one, percentage might be off. Pastor Patrick, you can check me. It's something like 90% of unique material. Yeah, which is to say that 90% of the Gospel of John is not pulling off of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you remember the last 6 weeks, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have intertangled material. John is 90% of what you're reading, you're seeing for the first time. So he's not repeating anything. He's filling in a lot of the things that we don't know, and he's going much deeper. And when he does it, and then finally, he has this structure that he uses focused around the number 7. There's the 7 signs, there's the 7 I am statements, there's the 7 discourses. John loves the number of 7, which is the number of completion. He uses it as a narrative tool to be able to teach some things about the person of Jesus. Not that I think there would be any questions here, but any questions on this so far? Amazing. You guys are the smartest class we've ever taught. Okay. If I were to take the book of John, there's almost like a two-way split that you can kind of cut the book of John sort of in half, okay? Matthew, if you remember, has sort of like this 5 discourse architecture. John just divides it into 2 sections. There is the book of signs, which are chapters 1 through 12. And then you have the book of glory, which are chapters 13 to 21. And it's good because when you're reading through them, you can sort of parse and see that what he's trying to say over here is then fulfilled in this part over here. So we're splitting the book of John almost in half. A lot of these times, I think when we read through the Bible, I think because we forget that these were like writers, they are very intentional about what they're writing, and they are using tools to make it make sense. When they split their books, they didn't just randomly decide to do it. There was strategy and purpose behind it. These were people who were doing things knowing that they were going to be read and wanting them to be understood. And so if you go back over the last few weeks and you see how each one of them cut it up differently, that's not just like a magic, well, let's just try it. A lot of thought went into how these things were written. And that's why I think I enjoy reading these things so much, because you're like, man, someone, in this case, John, really thought about how we were going to read this and wanted it to impact us in a certain way. That's where we see the split of stuff like this. We're going to go right into the actual Bible here. Like last time, I'll go through a few sections at a time. And then what we'll do, similar to Matthew over here, I'm going to cut it up into these sections like this, okay? At any moment, you can ask me to stop, and we will take a little breather. Like I said, we'll be doing this for 2 weeks, and I think I have, yes, more than enough material for the next 2 weeks. Okay, prologue. Let's start right in the beginning. Let's do chapter 1, and for the sake of just making sense of what's happening, these are the verses we're going to focus on. Are you guys familiar with like prologues as a whole? Like these intro entry point things that explain what's going on? The prologue here is really interesting because John is making a claim. There's this big idea that he's pitching right in the beginning, and he's hoping that's going to carry throughout the whole course of the book. The whole idea here is that Jesus is the eternal Word of God who became flesh. There's this idea that Jesus is not just a man, he clearly is a part of this divine Trinity, and he placed himself into our lives as this physical, tangible person to be able to experience life with us. That is his claim from the get-go. He starts chapter 1 with in the beginning, which if you've read the Bible, there's another book that starts with in the beginning. That's we see that in Genesis. There's this really interesting thing that he's doing. He's starting in the beginning, knowing that people who would read this would be able to contrast it to the beginning of Genesis. One thing that I love with these Bible authors is that sometimes when they repeat phrases or terms or statements, it's not by chance. They're very intentionally trying to, is a term, what does Tim Mackey, hyperlink? They're trying to hyperlink moments together, which is essentially connected the dots on things. So by saying in the beginning in John, something in your brain should go, kind of like in the beginning in Genesis. Correct. That's exactly the point that he's trying to make. In the beginning, he's saying that Jesus is not someone whose story starts with his birth. It starts way before anything was ever created, way before the universe existed, way before the earth was there. In Greek philosophy, the word he uses is the idea of logos that's put in there, which I don't know if you knew this, Pastor Patrick, that was interesting. It is considered the rational principle holding the universe together. So essentially, Jesus was a part, not just of creation, but he was a part of the very being that holds all things together in place. But you have to really think about this from like a very, very profound level. Jesus is a person. That's what we know. He lived, he walked, he lived, he breathed. But he's also holding together all of the universe, and he was involved in the creation of all things in the beginning. Two very, very distinct things. People who would have encountered Jesus would have known him as like the guy whose dad was a carpenter, and he did those things, and he healed the people. John is saying he is that person, but he's also the person that was involved in every intimate detail of the universe. The reason that there's stars in the sky, gravity, birds, fish, all of those things, Jesus was involved in. One thing you can do when you read the book of John is read John chapter 1 and then go to read Genesis 1 and 2, and you go, okay, so all of those things that happened in creation, Jesus was a part of and involved in. It puts a lot of weight into the book of John because you're going into it being like, okay, so before anything was formed, Jesus was there and a part of that process. And the rest of what you're going to read in the book of John is about that person, not just the human, but the deity, this divine person that was there. The way that John uses this language here is he says that the Word became flesh, became this human aspect, and dwelt among us. Which is really important because the word dwelt can be in the original language is like, dude, I love it when you get thoughts before me. Tabernacle. You're quite literally, the presence that filled the tabernacle in Exodus has moved into a human body. So think about how interesting that is. We talked about this even in class on Tuesday. You read about how there was this place in the Old Testament where the presence of God would inhabit. That same presence is now in a human body and is walking around and interacting with us. That is a very big claim. That's a very big idea. That's why I think words in the Bible matter so much, because when you read dwelt just as dwelt in English, you go, yeah, he was around us. He wasn't just around us. It was the Spirit of God in a body that happened to be, like, it's a very profound thing. And everything that comes after this is based around this idea. When we read all of John, we're reading it through the context that Jesus was involved in the creation of all things. He was a part of all things. He is the presence that we see in the tabernacle in the Old Testament has literally entered a physical body. Are those from our people from our class? I don't know, actually. Yeah, if you can check, because they might be people from the wrestling team, or they might be people trying to get into class. If you want to read the book of John and have it make the most sense, I would say read the prologue and read Genesis 1 and 2. Spend some time really focusing on what that means, and then read the rest of John together. It's going to add an extra level of weight to everything. Any questions on this so far? Yeah.
So kind of like simplifying it. So him stating like that Jesus was the Word and the Word was in the beginning is like Jesus is God.
He's making that claim. Yes. He's making the claim that this guy is not just a guy. He's the person that, okay, remember in terms of like context, a lot of people who would have read this would have been Jewish people who have this idea of the fact that God was in the beginning doing all these things. This is almost like an Easter egg that John writes, so that when they read it, they go, what is he saying? Oh, he's making a claim that in the beginning, that thing, that idea that we were taught since kids, the Jesus that is walking was involved in that process. It's a very deep statement that he's making that, again, we can just glance over it, but he's actually making a very deep claim there. He's saying when you think about the narrative of everything existing, Jesus was involved in that process, and he's also physically walking with us right now, which is like a really weird, yeah. Think about this from like a metaphysical level, right? If you knew about Jesus as a physical person and you're human and that's all you've known, you're not assuming that that same person was involved in the creation of everything. He's saying, yes, that is exactly what the claim that I'm making is. The guy that we heard about who did those things was also present when God gave Adam the ability to name the platypus. You know what I mean? Like, it's a very specific moment there. Any questions? Any other things, comments on this? Amazing. We move into the book of signs. I don't know why I did that. Sometimes my weird stuff just kind of bleeds out during my classes, so I apologize for that. Book of signs. This is quite literally chapters 1 through 12, more or less. We're going to sort of hit some of this. But what we see here is that there are a certain amount of miracles. Can anyone guess how many miracles? Wow, 7 miracles that John uses to drive home this point. Now, one thing that I've always found really interesting is that surely Jesus has done more than these 7 miracles. John chooses these 7 to relay over the fact that Jesus is able to tap into the deity aspects of who he is and do things that are supernatural. There's something about these 7 that should resonate with us. I think all of these are ones that you will know, but the idea is that they're significant. They're significant enough that John chooses these 7 to drive the point home. And the cool thing about what we see here is that it gives a wide spectrum of responses. So in every one of these miracles he talks about, the way people respond in some cases is good. They're like, amazing, we believe in you. Or get away from me. You know what I mean? Like, so he's giving this understanding that just because Jesus did the miraculous, it doesn't mean that every person's response was, wow, that's amazing. Sometimes it was met with hostility. Sometimes people couldn't get it. So I appreciate even that, because I think we talked about in the beginning classes that if the authors of the Bible were looking to paint a good picture, they would use 7 stories and end every single story with, and everyone believed and everyone was happy. That's not what John does. John makes it very clear. Some people couldn't get behind what Jesus did, and that's okay. And so the first one, and this is the one that I think we all know the most, is water to wine. Can I get an amen? Woo! Okay, people don't like wine here. That's fine. Okay. Summarizing this is the first miracle that Jesus does. One of my favorite miracles, because you see that there's this moment where they're at the party and the wine runs out, and biblical parties lasted longer than a day. And so to not have wine at a party that lasts a few days really was a poor judgment on the couple and their family. They didn't plan well. They didn't plan accordingly. I've always loved this parable the most because this one is not life-threatening, Jesus is going to go on to heal people who are paralyzed. He's going to go on to raise people from the dead. He's going to go out to do some really big things here. In the water to wine story, no one was dying. Nothing was urgent. There was no emergency. Huh? Yeah, but what I'm saying, my point is more like the worst case scenario here would have been that the couple would have been embarrassed. They would have been embarrassed. There would have been a little bit of shame on the family. Starting with this one is cool because it shows that Jesus cares about even the small things. Even the small things matter. Because right the next one, he's going to go heal the official's son, right? And like you're like, that was a very severe physical problem. Here, it's just shame. And you see, well, that matters to Jesus. Jesus gets involved in something that wasn't going to save anyone. It just saved face and made it so that they wouldn't be embarrassed. And yet, Jesus is in the picture. The party, summarizing, they run out of wine. Jesus' mom goes, hey, do the little thing. You know what I mean? Do the thing that I know that you can do, which is really cool. There's this moment there that shows that Mary knew something about her son was special. And Jesus goes on to turn 120 to 180 gallons of water into wine. Now, notice a few points here. One, there's an abundance of this overflow, which is intentional, right? It's not that we believe in this prosperity gospel sort of thing, but we do recognize that when Jesus does move, there's this like abundance in what comes. He doesn't just form enough water to get through. He makes a lot of wine. And not only that, the wine is very, very good. The people at the party were saying, hey, usually you serve the cheaper wine towards the end, because at that point, people are so drunk they can't even tell what they're consuming, but you brought out the best wine. This is really, really good wine. The beauty about this too is that it seems to, based off the text, the only people who really knew what happened were Jesus, Mary, and the servers. No one else knows what happened here. One of the commentators that I was reading was like, based on the language, there's also like no clear explanation as to how the water turned into wine. And so as far as we know, these people were filling pitchers with water, and as they were pouring it, wine was coming out, which you can imagine, like no one else, to anyone else watching, no, they're just pouring wine. But to the people who had to go gather the water, they're like, we didn't put wine in these pitchers. We put water in these pitchers, and the water now has magically become wine. This is, I think, such a beautiful entry into the miracles, because you go, whoa, no one was dying. It was non-urgent. Jesus could have left and like nothing would have happened. And yet, because this couple would have been embarrassed and there would have been shame, that still warrants enough of Jesus stepping in and doing this miraculous thing there, which I think is really, really cool. I think it shows that our Jesus does care about the really big things, and he also cares about the shame and even those small things, which is really cool. You know what? You're not wrong. You're not wrong. Yes. In here, obviously, we go from chapter 2. We would be going into John chapter 3. I'm going to save that for next week. That's not one of the miracles, but I think John chapter 3 warrants a little bit of discussion time because it is quite important. And so we go into the healing of the official's son. And that is in 4:46 to 54. Now, you're going to see there are some gaps in here. I'm not skipping anything. There are just some filler sections for the sake of just getting through all of this. We're not going to hit all the points. But the cool thing about this one here specifically is that this is one of those situations where Jesus is healing, but Jesus never gets to the boy. He never actually sees the boy. He heals from a distance, which gives a very supernatural thing there, because there is this idea that the official was able to believe that Jesus could heal before seeing any of the healing. And that almost then ties into the idea of blessed are those who believe without seeing, that before they're able to see, they're able to believe that Jesus can move. I think I'm not going to, please, any healing is miraculous. Healing someone that you didn't even have to be in a room with is insane to me, to think about that you could be many, many miles away. Jesus says your son is healed. And when the official finally connects the dots, they're like, no. It seems to be that the moment that Jesus said it here is the same time when your son actually became well over here. The biggest part about, the pull away from that part is like, we should be able to take away the understanding that our belief comes before seeing. We believe before we see the miracle. We believe before Jesus moves. We believe before any proof is brought to the table. Number 3, the paralyzed man, which he heals a lot of paralyzed people. This is at the Pool of Bethesda. Yeah, that's a good name. This one is funny because this is where you start to see a little bit of the hostility between the leaders, because Jesus heals a paralyzed man, and that upsets the religious leaders because of when and where it happened. So you start to see how conflict begins to sort of like muster up, where Jesus can do the right thing, but by doing the right thing at what the religious people consider the wrong time or the wrong place is seen as a wrong thing. And Jesus is going to start to really push on that a little bit. Because wouldn't it be a good thing to see someone who could never walk suddenly be able to walk? The general response should be, that's amazing. It's not the response he gets. He gets, why are you doing this today? That is a really, now let's be super honest, not to compare ourselves, but like that is like a church issue that we see happen today. It's still a thing that happens where oftentimes really good things are happening now. And then there's like, yeah, but the time or the service ran too long or this or that. And you're like, oh, you're not seeing that there's something more important happening here. I think about like those, I don't know if you ever historically looked at those really big church revival services, like the 10 services that went on for weeks. Can you imagine if someone went up and was like, we gotta shut down. You know what I mean? Like we're being too rowdy. It's time to shut the revival down. Like you can really miss what's happening in front of you because the rules and the regulations are so big. Now, does that mean that we should live in disorder? Absolutely not. But it does mean that in moments where you see this genuinely miraculous thing happen, that is seemingly more important than these rules and regulations that were being upheld for strictly religious and controlling reasons. You're going to add something?
Oh, no. Because we always say the thing about there's a big thing in the book.
Yeah.
Some people would say that, well, this day of the week, it should not be on this day because it takes you from convocation.
Oh my God, yeah.
So it was a huge deal.
Yeah, thousands of people are coming to know the Lord, but it's like, yeah, but then my Sunday service was not attended as well. Like, calm down. I'm with you on that one. Feeding the 5,000. This is a great one. This one also we'll touch upon later. This one precedes the whole I am the bread of life discourse, which is a very controversial part in the book of John. But it's a beautiful moment where John writes about how Jesus is able to take a very small amount of food and replicate it to feed thousands of people. Again, similar to the water wine situation, you have to really visualize the idea of Jesus having essentially a lunchbox worth of food and feeding 5,000 men, which scholars would say might be closer to 15 to 20 total thousand people because women and children weren't included in those head counts. And so there is a Jesus who's given this Lunchables, and he just keeps making more. And similar to the water to wine part, there's an abundance left over. There's more food than they could have imagined that they started with. And so there is this idea that Jesus is able to like metaphysically transform matter. I personally, I'm the type of person who I want to see just the logistics of it, right? Like I'm impressed with the thing, but was he just putting his hand into a bag and just pulling out? That's the part that I can't imagine. Like at one point, how many fish is he pulling out of this bag? How many loaves of bread are coming out to a point? And imagine this, right? Everyone's fed and he's just still going. And they're now trying to find baskets to fill, there's this overflow idea there. Again, that bleeds into the I am the bread of life discourse, which we will talk about in a moment. The walking on water, which not to say that this is sort of like any less impressive, but I think quite literally after replicating food, he just kind of tries to, how would I say this? He does something where he looks at literally the nature around him and goes, no. Historically, bodies of water were considered to be these very powerful and seemingly scary things. If you look at literature at the time, anytime water was mentioned, it was this idea of this unknown thing, right? The sea was scary, and what existed in the sea was scary, and the storms were scary, and there was no real way to like counterbalance these storms. The beauty is that there is this water that should be a thing that is fearful to people, and Jesus is just walking on it as if it's this physical surface. there's going to be a moment, there's an I am thing that we're going to touch about there too, which again, some of these will make more sense once we hit the I am statements and we'll tie them together. But Jesus walks on water here, which you've read also in Mark? Which one is it where Peter walks? Mark or Matthew? I can't remember. And one of the other gospel accounts. Yeah, fisherman. Of course, the fisherman comment. Two more, and we'll pause for questions. Healing the blind man. But this is the blind man who was born blind. Born blind. This is chapter 9. This is the most narratively developed sign. If you read into it, there's a whole chapter dedicated to it. There's a lot of little details worth going. The really fun thing is here is as the man's faith begins to grow, so does the Pharisees' hostility. You see this weird thing where like this man who was born blind, people would have known his whole life that he was blind. The whole surrounding town would have been like, oh, that's blind John. He's been blind forever. Blind John is now seeing. And again, you would think that people would go, that's amazing. Not the response. They're not happy at this. But we start to see this real, the language John uses is this tangible idea of how there is light and there is darkness, and they are sort of contrasting each other. As this man is seeing things and his sight is finally given to him, and there's this beautiful light that enters the room, the hostility and the darkness from the Pharisees also starts to grow. And there's this real battle that John is sort of proposing. And finally, this is a big one, the raising of Lazarus, which let me just make this part from a narrative perspective. I think it's beautiful. We start with water to wine. That is like not an urgent thing at all. And then we end with raising the guy who was dead. So that's a pretty big spectrum of what Jesus's miraculous abilities are able to do. Here's a little bit of water that I'm going to convert into wine for you to drink because it's fun at a wedding. This guy was dead and he's no longer dead. Anything that you go through can fit within that range of miracles. You know what I mean? Any other thing that happens suddenly begins to make sense there because you go, of course he can heal a blind man if he raised a dead person, you know? And so one thing that I think is really good about when we look at these and we compare them is that not that we're ranking which one's the most impressive and which one's the least impressive. John gives us a very wide range to be able to look at everything and say all of the miracles encompass from what seems to be the least significant to the absolute most significant. And the big thing is that Jesus raises a man who's been dead for a few days. Ironically, after raising the man who was dead, this is kind of what triggers the plot to then want to kill Jesus. And one of the theologians I read says, the one who gives life is sentenced to death because of it. Quite literally what we're seeing in this moment. Each one of these signs, as you read them and as you put them in through a timeline, what you realize is that it's not even just that by the time you get here, that the Pharisees are debating Jesus. They are actively planning his execution, you know? The signs don't just reveal Jesus, but they force the religious leaders to have to make a decision about whether or not he should be kept around and allowed to live. And so it starts to get a little dramatic. You start to see how the narrative gets a little bit more from, haha, wine at a party, to we're going to have to kill this Jesus guy. It's like a pretty large jump in drastic nature. Any questions? Any comments?
In chapter 7,
Mm-hmm.
verse 37 to 39, Jesus talked about is that clean water. Anybody want water?
Yeah.
Yes, then that's what it is.
We will touch on those. I have a few extra chapters that are sprinkled in there. But yes, we will get to. I jumped through because these are just the miracles. I'm trying to hit the idea of those miracles in there. But there are gaps like here, gaps here. We're gonna fill in those gaps over the next few weeks. Let's hit the I am statements, or try to hit the I am statements. We will finish them in, I think, next week. So those are 7 miracles, and then there are 7 I am statements, which is really good. Every one of these statements uses the Greek phrase ego, which I can't. Pastor Patrick, can you pronounce this? Ego eimi. Amazing. When God speaks to Moses from the burning bush, and Moses asks his name, God says, "You hear me." There's a very important thread there. That's a divine name. It's a name so holy that the Jewish people wouldn't say it out loud, you know? So every time that Jesus uses this phrase, he's not just completing a statement. He's invoking the name of God, which we don't see as significant. But when the audience heard it, it meant a lot to them. It was a really weighty thing to do. That's why they kept reaching for stones, because they were quite upset at the fact that he's making these comments. This is a very loaded thing to say. You see that the 7 that we're going to list usually are the metaphorical ones, but there are also absolute statements. When Jesus uses this term, there's the way he uses it metaphorically and then absolutely. John chapter 8, verse 59 is like the most clear one, where he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." He's not saying I was, he's saying I am. That's present tense across all of it. Again, this bothered the religious people. This is not like a normal thing to say. And so what I like about Jesus, he's kind of sassy with it. He kind of says and uses terminology that he knows was going to upset people, but I don't think he's doing it for the sake of upsetting. He's connecting the dots on a bigger statement. He's saying, you guys don't know who I am, and I'm trying to show you that this is who I am. So 7 I am statements, right? We're not going to hit them all today. I'll hit like 2 or 3 of them. He says, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. That is John 6:35. That is Jesus saying, I satisfy the deepest hunger inside you. I satisfy the hunger that no one else can fill. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. This happens right after feeding the 5,000. The crowd is tracking Jesus down across the lake, and he names a real motive. You're not here because you want me. You're here because you saw what I can do, but I am the bread of life that can fill you in a way that no bread will ever be able to fill you. That's a really deep and profound statement to make. You contrast this almost like the manna in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 16. God is feeding Israel for 40 days, and Jesus is saying, Moses wasn't able to give you real bread. I am the real bread. I'm the real bread that Moses was always pointing to. Some people would say, who is it?
It's Australia.
Oh, hi. Some people would say that what's happening in the Old Testament is that manna was a preview of what was to come. It was something that was given to the people by God to feed them. Jesus saying, I'm going to feed you in a way that you couldn't even imagine. The reason why this becomes very hard is that the people don't like this. They start to grumble. They get upset at this. Disciples start walking away. People who followed him are no longer following him. John 6, verse, I think it's 66, which is kind of funny, the 666. It's the only place in the gospel where it clearly says that the followers left him, that they couldn't do it. And John includes this on purpose. Again, he's not trying to prove that this is a perfect story. He's showing that there's honesty in the story. People couldn't fathom this teaching. They couldn't make sense of it. This is also where, if you were raised Catholic, sometimes the discourse around communion about the bread can get a little bit tricky, which I'm not going to unpack or touch that today. But we don't think that Jesus was making a statement here about communion. He was making a bigger statement about who he was and what he was able to fill. And so John chapter 6 is not a argumentatively sound text when we talk about Catholic communion, because they're two very, very different things. I am the bread of life. Then he says, I am the light of the world. I am the light of the world. That is John 8:12, which is him saying in a way, I will reveal what is real. I am the one that can show you the realness of what's there. I think Tim Mackey says that Jesus shines a light on the idea that even the things that don't seem real are real, right? Things like healing. Healing doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem real. It is real when Jesus is involved. There is a level of realness that we can't see that is real because Jesus is a part of it, and he shows that to us. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. He's delivering this during the Feast of the Tabernacles, a festival that included a big lamplight ceremony where 4 huge menorahs were lit. They were visible across Jerusalem. Jesus makes his declaration the morning after. Why? Because these people were used to seeing these sources of light, and he's saying, I am the light of the world. When those lights go out, he's still around. His light cannot be extinguished. We see this a lot in the Old Testament. The fire that comes in through like the pillar in the Exodus, that's like a light source. The Lord is my light and my salvation. We see that in the book of Psalm. Isaiah says the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. So there's this language around light that's already known to the Jewish people that John continues to use that analogy. And the tension here is that he says, whoever follows me, not all of those, whoever. So he gives you this understanding that you can almost opt in to follow. Whoever chooses to follow, whoever wants to follow, you have to make a decision. You have to follow. This statement is an invitation to be a part of something, but it's not something that it seems everyone is going to do, which is a real reality. Although we want everyone to follow the light, it doesn't seem that everyone is going to follow the light. And yet, whoever follows will never be in darkness, but will have the light of life in them. Let me do one more, and then we'll stop for a few questions. We'll see if we have that one. He says, I am the gate. I am the gate. That is John 10:9, which is his way of saying, I am the only entry point. There is no other way. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out, and they will find pasture. This comes inside the Good Shepherd discourse. It's sandwiched between 2 images of shepherds. The gate and the shepherd are both Jesus. That's a shocking thing. John records that the crowds did not understand, so Jesus explains it twice. This is a real thing that you read. We understand these things, or we pretend to understand these things because we are in church and we've heard this a billion times. You can't imagine being in front of Jesus and hearing this for the first time and being like, what is he talking about? What do you mean that he's the gate? What is he? We have the luxury of knowing that he died and that he resurrected. The people hearing for this for the first time, they just thought he was another rabbi who was a little crazy, you know? So we're able to decipher these things and go, wow, it makes a lot of sense to me. This made no sense to the people who were reading this. Even in the other gospel, in Matthew, when Jesus talks about how he's going to go to a place where they can't follow, they're like, that doesn't make any sense. We're going to follow you wherever you go. And he's like, you physically can't go to this place. And Peter's like, I'm going to go. Like, they couldn't grasp it. And so the big thing about shepherd gates that you see back then is that they were very simple. They were kind of just like this big opening in a stone where the shepherd would lie down at night, making it so that you couldn't get out. The sheep couldn't leave. There was no latch. There was no lock. It wasn't this super hard thing to do. The shepherd himself was the security. He put himself in there. Think about how beautiful that analogy is. Jesus is the gate, but it's not this profound thing that you need a key to get in through. The shepherd lets you in. He's the one who's there, and the shepherd will move out of the way and allow you to come in, which is beautiful. The tension here, this is the hard part, is Jesus says, all who came before me were what? Thieves and robbers. He's talking about all of the false teaching and the false leaders and the false messiahs and the corrupt religious leaders who use the sheep for their own ends. The exclusivity is protective. It's not punitive. He's not keeping people out. He's just keeping the wolves out. That's the analogy that he's trying to say. His job is not to keep people from coming in. He's the gate. Come on in. His job is to make sure that no wolves are in there to be able to take the sheep out. We're going to land this here because it's 9:55. Any questions on these so far? Any questions on anything from today? I know that John is weird because it's a lot of like hyper mental theological teaching, but any thoughts or any questions? Anything to add? Everyone's like, no, because you guys are all brilliant theologians who understand everything. You know what? Then we're just going to do one more because if there's no questions, I am the good shepherd, which he literally says, okay, can you guys laugh at me for a second? I could not spell shepherd for a majority of my life until I made it shep and then herd. Like literally the herd is how I had to literally get my This is John 10:11. So it's like right after the gate thing. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. That's what he's saying, which immediately follows the gate image because it's the same discourse. It's the same crowd. Jesus is extending the metaphor and he's introducing some defining characteristics that the good shepherd is willing to die for his sheep, which is what our shepherd does. The hired hand runs when the wolves come. The shepherd stays. He's unmoving. He's unwavering there. Shepherds are really interesting because in the Old Testament, they're referenced quite a bit. David himself was literally a shepherd before he was a king. Psalm 23 starts with, "The Lord is my shepherd." That's like the most beloved psalm ever. Ezekiel 34, God promises to personally shepherd his people. Isaiah 40, he gathers the lamb in his arms. So he's not just using a pastoral metaphor. He's claiming the identity of God in the Old Testament, who would promise to shepherd his people. And Jesus is saying, I'm doing the same thing. God said he would shepherd Israel. I am a shepherd. I'm here to shepherd and to lead and to guide. The big part of this one that's fun is that the line where he says, I know my own and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. Knowing between the shepherd and the sheep is placed on the same level as knowing within the Trinity, which is to say, to be known by Jesus is to be drawn into the inner life of God. We know the understanding that oftentimes we go, well, I know who Jesus is. Yes, but Jesus also knows you. That's a really big thing. The shepherd knows his sheep and the sheep know the shepherd. Think about the example that Jesus used about the shepherd who leaves the 99 for the one. The fact that he knew that one was missing. So it's not just the understanding that we get to claim, oh, I know Jesus. That's true. Jesus also knows you. And there's something really beautiful and profound about that. That he is the one that we go through to get to the Father. He's not blocking us out. He's just making sure that the wolves can't get in. He is both the gate and he is the shepherd. And we will officially end there, 9:58 for today. Any thoughts? Any questions? You guys are so smart. So smart, so smart, so smart. I'm also realizing I don't know if I could finish all of it next week, but maybe. I'll probably finish all of it next week. Maybe, probably. Cool. Huh? I really want to honor the 10 a.m. thing. I'm really trying to make sure we're getting. And if we had started earlier because of the traffic, I think we would have finished the I am. You guys are dismissed.